All right, everyone, this is a short but really important lecture about two key terms that you will not find in your book. The first of which is a cultural landscape. A cultural landscape is a really important term in AP Human Geography. I would actually say that it's perhaps the most important. And the reason for this, it is the foundation of what AP Human Geography is all about. If we're talking about a cultural landscape, the definition is a characteristic and tangible outcome. So when we're talking about a characteristic and tangible outcome, that means something that is a common and also something that is visible, it is seen, you can touch it, a result. So we're looking at a common result of the complex interactions between a human group of people and its natural environment. So we're looking at a more human version of the natural landscape. This is different than asking you to actually describe the natural or physical landscape. And the natural or physical landscape is more of a physical geography idea. You would probably describe a physical or natural landscape with site factors, things like soil type, elevation, climate. It could be biomes, it could be rock formations. All of those things would be descriptions of natural landscapes. A cultural landscape is a little bit different. This is actually looking at how humans imprint their culture on the landscape. So, what is it that we do to the physical environment in order to make it somewhere that we can live? And not only somewhere that we can live, but also somewhere that reflects our culture. So, the things that we care for and the things that we care about. There's a guy named Carl Sauer. Carl Sauer, in my opinion, is sort of like the father of human geography. He's the one that's credited with this idea of studying cultural landscapes. And what he wanted to do was try to understand the material expressions of culture. So again, material culture of a group of people by focusing on how that material culture is set up across a landscape. What do we do to modify the landscape? How do we use the landscape to support our cultural needs? He uses this idea by looking at the built environment. The built environment is exactly what I was just talking about. It is the human-made surroundings that provide the setting for our human activity. So instead of actually describing the physical landscape, a cultural landscape, a lot of times AP Human Geography, especially College Board, they like to ask you to describe the cultural landscape of, say, an MDC or an LDC, or a predominantly Islamic culture, or a predominantly Christian culture, or how would you know from the cultural landscape that a Hindu group of people are congregating in an area? And so what it's asking you to do is look at what you actually see humans doing to the environment, and then deciding how those interactions demonstrate the people's culture. So a good example of that, an LDC, you may see that the cultural landscape of an LDC is still somewhat primitive. They may not have fully developed infrastructure. At the same time, you might see patterns of folk culture across the landscape. So you still might see maybe some sort of tribal or folk housing. It could be. It also could be folk religious types of things. Like if we were talking about totems in the Native Americans and North America. Those types of things would be cultural landscape. If we're looking at pop culture, the pop cultural landscape would probably look rather different. You would see a high amount of technology being used for good infrastructure. It could be reinforced roads and bridges. It could be popular housing that changes over time with trends instead of really for environmental purposes. You could also see, obviously, pop culture influence on clothing, or pop culture influence on how we create businesses and logos and branding and really uniform landscapes. Another example of a cultural landscape would be maybe looking at, for example, an Islamic culture. You might find that a mosque is going to be at the center of the cities, and that it's probably the highest building in the town, particularly if we're talking about still a peripheral, semi-peripheral country. A Christian city, you may see and be able to determine that Christianity is at play when you see a church or a cathedral with a spear sort of, high, again, usually at the center of town and usually the highest up in terms of vertical space. So that might also demonstrate a cultural landscape there. A Hindu culture, you may see the presence of shrines. You may also see the presence of cows because, of course, cows are sacred, and so you would see them on the cultural landscape. All of those things are what we use to determine the interactions between a group of people and their environment in a way that is culturally sensitive to their needs. This is an example. So this is Kansas City. You can see that we have actually done a lot to modify our landscape. We have preserved some things in our physical landscape, but that preservation is also probably a part of our culture. We didn't preserve it because it was too difficult to maintain. We preserved all of the trees and the grass and that sort of thing because we felt that it brought some sort of importance to an area. And that is, of course, Union Station and creating sort of a park-like atmosphere around it. You'll also see a use of vertical space. So the taller the buildings, typically, there's two ways that you could look at this. Either population density increases, and therefore you need to build up in order to accommodate all of your people, or it could be a different sort of sense, and that could be more of the cultural sense of power. The taller the building, the more important it is. For Kansas City, I think you guys would agree, people aren't being jam-packed into the city, therefore causing us to build these skyscrapers. Instead, this is more of the cultural element of power. If you're going to have a prestigious law firm, you would rather be seen in a skyscraper rather than in maybe a strip mall behind Hobby Lobby. And so therefore that brings esteem. You can also see change over time. You can also see preservation over time. So things like Union Station, really a much older building built out of stone, whereas you can see in the background, you actually see some of the skyscrapers that are built. You can actually see the Sprint Center as well. It's built with a great deal of new technological advances. You see glass, reflective materials, that type of thing. You can see more of an industrial part of town as well around the brick area. And again, we show that we actually care about our past by looking at Union Station because it is preserved. It could have been something that was bulldozed, that type of thing, but it wasn't. Here's another example. This is Paris, of course. The cultural landscape, they have changed the landscape quite a bit, the physical landscape, by putting in place roads and infrastructure and buildings, but you'll also see that they've set apart some importance to the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower was actually meant to be a temporary structure. However, it's become sort of symbolic of Paris, and because of that, they have laws about buildings that go in next to it. They can't be over a certain height because you don't want to obscure the view of the Eiffel Tower, especially in photographs and things like that. It's very iconic. So instead, you'll see actually the legislature behind it is the building with the columns. That also would indicate that there's some influence from Greek and Roman history. And so if you were a cultural geographer, or asked to look at the cultural landscape, that would actually you could determine that just by looking at the types of architecture that you see there. You can see green space, although it looks like it's kind of autumn there. So it's still, instead of trees being sort of grown up in an area, because it's like maybe they lack the infrastructure actually, do anything or modify that environment. This has actually been purposely preserved. So there's a park-like atmosphere for entertainment and for tourism purposes. And then you'll actually see there's a little bit of a break between what I would call the old town and the new town, and that's actually the river. And it also has a park area on both sides of the river with walking trails and trees and that type of thing. You'll see that all of the skyscrapers in their background, and you can probably determine that they care about progress and they care about, again, success, maybe prestige shown through vertical power. And again, probably those are probably not buildings that are being built for population density issues. It's probably more of a power thing. The cranes would indicate that they're still building, so it's a developing area still. And again, you can see newer materials being used in the back, which probably demonstrates some sort of preference for progress. Here's another one. This one's a little bit different. So you can see that the natural landscape is less touched. So they have put a human imprint on the landscape. So you do see roads, you do see infrastructure. So things like street lights, power lines, that type of thing, buildings. But you can see that the natural environment is still somewhat intact, which means either they're choosing to keep it wet that way, or maybe the population is not so large that it needs to infringe upon the physical environment in such a manner as the other two cities. You could also probably determine that this is a likely an area that where there are Christians. You couldn't really say that that's a Christian majority, but you could certainly guess that there are Christians living in the area, and that's because, of course, the prevalence of the church architecture with the steeple, the idea that the taller the steeple, sort of the closer to God. And this one appears to be not super ornate. Typically, that's characteristic of a Protestant Christian church. We'll talk more about that in chapter 6. I would say that they still demonstrate cultural pride for preserving the past, probably the church and some of the older buildings. I would also say that they probably do look forward for progress. You can actually see it's kind of hard to tell, but there's a gas station, and you can see, modern day, cars and that type of thing. So this is probably cultural landscape of an area in maybe northeast United States, where there's a large amount of Christianity and also sort of the rolling hills of maybe Appalachia or the mountains of the northeast United States. Here's another one. This one is also interesting to think about. So the cultural landscape here is more of a folk cultural landscape. They have put an imprint on the culture, on the physical environment, but that imprint tends to be a rather primitive one. They're using the products that are in the environment. So this is not characteristic of pop culture. They probably are limited by the types of materials that they're able to use. However, not only are they showing a preference for environmental materials being used, but they're also using a pitched roof, which means that it probably does rain on occasion, so rain is not sort of setting on top of the reeds. Additionally, this also demonstrates the importance of maybe family or tribe. In the middle, you'll actually see there's a corral area, and that's typically where they keep their herding animals. So they'll herd animals during the day and they'll return to their homes. And put them in the middle for protection, but also for the purpose of sharing those herding animals, oftentimes for milk. So the other key term actually relates to this and is an example of something that we already looked at, and this is historical geography. Historical geography was actually created by a guy named H.C. Darby from Great Britain. He was a geographer that studied the past. He studied basically the cultural landscape that was left behind by humans over time. So this was actually developed based on looking at the Domesday Book by William the Conqueror, which was compiled basically in 1085 when they started to go around and conquered places. They also kept records of the land that they conquered, who owned it, what was located there, what type of spoils of war they were basically rewarded with. And so H.C. Darby went back and started looking at these and said you can determine a lot about a culture and the people that lived there prior to those who are there today by looking at that built environment over time. So I want you to consider there's a key term that we have already learned that would describe the process that would actually contribute to the study of historical geography, the process of previous inhabitants leaving their imprint on the landscape. So consider, for example, in Kansas City, these are people who have come long before us. So we're looking at Life magazine. This is, if you look, it's around the 1940s. This is Union Station, and you can see the background of Kansas City differs quite a bit from the background that we were looking at earlier. You can still see that they place a great deal of importance on this building. And the building then was actually much more purposeful. This was for the actual use of sending people to and from our country or to our city. This is actually where a lot of people, including my great-grandfather, actually left for World War II. So you can see the importance there. You can see progress in the background. This, of course, is what it looks like today. So you can see the human imprint over time. Here's another example. This is New York City. It actually demonstrates over time progress. You can also see transportation. You can see trade. So you can see all of the changes over time. And of course, the Freedom Tower is not pink, but that's before it was built. That's where they believed it was going to go. If you're really interested in this, you can actually go to Google Earth Engine time lapse. And this is a time lapse that will actually show you change over time in many different places. And I would urge you to check it out. It's a really, really good example of studying historical geography.